he would put pro-gun and pro-life justices on the court, and Roe v. Wade would be overturned automatically. Brett Kavanaugh appears to meet all of President Trump's promises of how his candidate will rule on specific issues. His record on the bench in the Bush White House and as a Republican political operative indicates that, if confirmed, he would be among the most conservative justices in Supreme Court history. His views are outside the mainstream, and there's every reason to believe he would overturn Roe. While overturning Roe would set back women's freedoms and limit access to comprehensive health care, the reality is it will impact all Americans, because we all have a stake in whether constitutional principles are observed. Roe is a fundamental piece of case law. It upholds our personal liberty and privacy rights, like the ability to marry whomever you love and the right to use contraception in deciding when and if to have a family. Because the issue of gun safety is so important to me, I want to mention how extreme Kavanaugh's views are in this area. Even though 5 circuit courts have upheld bans against assault weapons, he argued in 2011 against Washington, D.C.'s ban because weapons like AR-15s are in, quote, common use, end quote. When you combine President Trump's repeated promises about his pro-life and pro-gun nominees and Kavanaugh's record, there's every reason to believe that this nominee will fulfill those promises. And we will go by seniority on the committee. Senator Schumer is on his way, and I know everyone will yield when he arrives. So I'd like to introduce the distinguished Patrick Leahy, former chair.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. What I said in Vermont, I'll say here, that I have a message for Donald Trump. The Constitution doesn't direct the president to nominate justices with the advice and consent of the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. The Constitution gives that role to the Senate. But I think the president looks at our independent courts like he does the Justice Department. He thinks the courts, as well as the Justice Department, should be an arm of the White House. Just last month, the Justice Department said it would no longer defend protections for people with pre-existing medical conditions. That's an extraordinary step. It goes way against what Justice Department has done before, but it followed the dictates of the White House. I've been here for the last 17 nominations to the Supreme Court, including every sitting member of the court. But whether you consider Roe versus Wade or affordable health care, marriage equality, voting rights, so much more, I've never seen so much at stake with just one seat. Unlike Senate Republicans who mounted an unprecedented, shameful blockade of Chief Judge Garland to the court, we Democrats actually take our constitutional obligations seriously. And I'm going to withhold my consent for this nominee or any other nominee who seeks to reverse 45 years of settled law protecting a woman's right to make her own health decisions, who intends to strip away insurance protection for millions of Americans with pre-existing conditions, who sides with the powerful over hard-working Americans, or anyone who believes and shares the president's belief the courts are an extension of the president's power, not a check against it. So the court's aspiration, after all, is to provide equal justice under law. That's what it says in the Vermont marble over its front doors. That's what we Vermonters feel, and that's what this nominee has yet to prove. And I see our leader here, so I'll yield to the senator. You're here, I am.
Well, I want to thank our members of the Judiciary Committee, led by Ranking Member Feinstein, for the great job they do. It's one of the most talented group of senators that I have ever seen assembled. And I've seen a lot of senators assembled. So thank you all. Now, last night, President Trump took a step that millions of Americans feared he would take, and nominated to the Supreme Court someone who would fill his campaign promise to overturn Roe and declare health care for Americans unconstitutional. With Judge Kavanaugh's nomination, the president has put women's reproductive rights and vital health care protections, particularly those that protect families with pre-existing conditions, at grave, grave risk. The American people cannot afford either. For every American who cares about women's health, about protections for people with pre-existing conditions, about civil rights, labor rights, LGBTQ rights, environmental rights, now is the time to fight. Now. Now is the time for American people to make their voices heard, loudly, clearly, from one end of this country to the other. Now is the time to demand a justice who will protect our health care, not strike it down. Now is the time to demand a justice who recognizes a woman's personal liberty, her right to make her own health care choices, instead of one who will put the government between a woman and her doctor. Now is the time to fight for the freedoms and rights that all Americans deserve. And that's what's at stake with this Supreme Court nomination. We knew that if President Trump picked his nominee from the list of 25 that was written by Special Interest Federal Society and Heritage Foundation, the nominee would be prepared to overturn Roe and to strike down the health care law. Those two organizations are dedicated to getting rid of Roe and getting rid of the Affordable Care Act. Leonard Leo, who runs the Federalist Society, his goal in life is to get a Supreme Court to repeal Roe. Does anyone think any of those 25 names, including Judge Kavanaugh, would protect Roe? They wouldn't be on the list if they were. You know that.
responsibility on the Senate Judiciary Committee, if you really want to know what that Supreme Court justice is going to do, you pay some attention to what they say in the hearing. Pay closer attention to what they've done with their lives, where they have been, the kind of decisions, political decisions, which they made over and over again. We know Brett Kavanaugh. We knew him when his name came up for the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. We know what he would mean to the Supreme Court. On behalf of the millions of Americans who are counting on this court to protect their freedoms, to protect our union and protect this Constitution, this Senate Judiciary Committee is ready to act.
This nominee, like other recent Republican nominees to the Supreme Court, has had to run a special interest obstacle course moderated by the Federalist Society. As a committee, we need to understand what assurances were made to those special interests as this nominee ran that obstacle course that put him at the top of the list. That is a vitally important question. You may say it is improbable that we are in a country where that question would need to be asked. But you can look at 24 5-4 decisions, partisan decisions of the United States Supreme Court that inevitably and predictably decide in favor of Republican political interests at the polls and with dark money, and predictably decide in favor of big Republican corporate special interests, both against accountability to their employees and against accountability to regulators. We are going to look into what went on and what assurances were made that brought this name to the top of the list. And it has particular impact for regular Americans if there were assurances made that this nominee will appeal Roe v. Wade and take away a woman's right to determine her own reproductive future. And if he made assurances that he would support this administration's position that protecting people's right to get health insurance, even with a pre-existing condition, is something that is unconstitutional. Those are vital questions, and we look forward to drilling into them. There is enormous grounds for suspicion right now about this nominee. And with that, I turn it to my distinguished colleague from Minnesota, Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you. I'm going to talk directly to the American people, because sometimes people say, what do the American people care about who's on the court? Well, it is the court that makes the decisions and has made the decisions in the last few decades about who you can marry, about where you can work, about if you can vote. And in the case of my grandpa, who worked 1,500 feet underground in the mines his whole life, about if his workplace was safe. And I wouldn't be here without those kinds of court rulings. Yeah. That's what this is about. So when you look at this nominee, Judge Kavanaugh, you see someone who has not upheld those rights so many times. You look at his rulings on health care that my colleagues have discussed. You look at his rulings on reproductive rights. You look at his rulings on consumer issues. Those people that thought it was wrong when Wall Street ran amok and ran over all of us and took the cars and drove off, well, this judge ruled that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that was set up to protect you, that was unconstitutional. That's what he said. And for people out there that want to have net neutrality, they think that regular people should be able to have the same access to the internet as the wealthy people or the big corporations, he said the opposite. He dissented in that case, and he said that that's not true, that they shouldn't be able to protect net neutrality. We cannot go back to a time when women are made criminals for making a choice about what to do with their own bodies. We cannot go back to a time when they can't make a decision about their own contraceptive. When you look at what's happening in this country, people want to move forward. That's why you see people marching. That's why you see people voting. That's why you see them organizing like never before. We cannot go back to a time when health insurance companies can just kick you off if you have a pre-existing condition. And that is a case that's heading right to that court right now. I know it in my own life. When my daughter was born, she couldn't swallow. They didn't think she was going to make it. She was in the hospital for weeks. but we got to have health insurance, and we got to keep having health insurance, even though we didn't know if she was going to make it. I want other moms to have that same feeling, that they know that their kids can be protected. That's why we need a judge who's in the real world, who's independent of a political ideology, and who makes the decisions for the people. That's why this is so important. With that, I turn it over to my great colleague from Delaware, Senator Coons.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar, and thank you for reminding us with very compelling personal stories about how courts matter, about how the decisions of the Supreme Court matter more than any other court's decisions in ways that have impacted you as a mother and as a daughter. The Supreme Court, the beautiful marble building behind us, is not a temple. It's not an academic institution. It is the place where 9 justices apply the Constitution to our society, to our lives, to our families. And courts have consequences. It didn't have to be this way. President Trump could have nominated someone last night, not off the narrow list of those pre-cleared, pre-approved by far-right organizations like the Heritage Foundation and Federalist Society. We could be here today discussing a nominee who was potentially someone with a wide-open record, someone who might command a bipartisan majority. Instead, we have someone who we know has a long record of being at the most conservative end of jurisprudence in our country, but we don't really know his full record. He was at the center of the Bush administration. He's written hundreds of opinions on the D.C. Circuit Court. And so the president, having now taken his constitutional step of nominating a Supreme Court justice, we have a job to do as the members of the Judiciary Committee to dig into his record, to go through it thoroughly, to demand the release of every single record that might be relevant so that you, the American people, might know what this next justice, if confirmed, might do with your rights, your liberties, and your freedoms. And then and only then should we have a hearing and take a vote. We must know this man's record, because where he's going with our court and our freedoms and our rights can best be predicted by how he's behaved and where he's been. At the center of so many issues in the Bush administration, in conversations and in decisions of the Federalist Society, and in his seat on the D.C. Circuit. Many said that because of the numbers, we in the Democratic minority had no chance of defeating a determined Republican majority in repealing the Affordable Care Act. That, in fact, turned out to not be true, because millions of Americans recognized their health care was at stake. And they called, they acted, they got engaged, they spoke out, they came here to our Capitol. It is my hope that Americans won't just look at the numbers of our 2 caucuses, but that they'll realize that courts matter, that this nominee will have an impact on your life, and as we dig into his record, you'll take up your role as citizens and speak out and communicate to your senator and to this Congress your passion for our making sure that the freedoms hard won over decades by key decisions of this court will not be rolled back in the event this man is confirmed. And the way to know that is to know his record and to hold him accountable. I look forward to your voice and to your role in making sure we win this fight for freedom. And let me now yield to a seasoned senior litigator, former Attorney General and member of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Coons, and thank you, Senator Schumer, for bringing us together. The fact is, I worked for a time in this building. I was a law clerk to Justice Harry Blackmun the year after he wrote the majority opinion in Roe v. Wade. I've argued cases in this building, 4 of them. I have deep respect, in fact, reverence for the United States Supreme Court as a central pillar of our democracy to speak truth to the powers across the street and down Pennsylvania Avenue. So I'm here with sadness to say, Judge Kavanaugh, you don't belong in this building as a justice. Judge Kavanaugh, you should not be serving in this building as a Supreme Court justice, because you have demonstrated an extraordinary hostility to the rights and liberties precious in this country that make this nation great. So here is a memo to the Parkland students. If you care about common sense gun violence protection, Judge Kavanaugh is your worst nightmare. If you want background checks or a ban on assault weapons or any of the other common sense, sensible measures that we have in Connecticut or California or New York, Judge Kavanaugh will strike them down. That's in his record. It's indisputable. He is the worst nightmare of advocates for common sense, sensible measures to stop the epidemic of gun violence in this country. Give him a seat on this court, and you can say goodbye to the measures in New York and Connecticut and California that have helped save lives. I'm a no on this nominee. My colleagues should be a no on this nominee unless Judge Kavanaugh specifically commits that he will recuse himself on any issues that involve President Trump's personal financial dealings or the special counsel. He will be the swing vote. Judge Kavanaugh, if he is a justice, would be the swing vote in deciding whether he can pardon himself, get out of jail free pass. That's the accountability that will be lost if Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed. Likewise, whether he can be called before a grand jury, whether he can be indicted while he's still president, whether he will be stopped from violating the Emoluments Clause of the United States Constitution, as he's doing every day, by taking foreign gifts and payments without coming to Congress for consent, whether our lawsuit, 200 of my colleagues have joined in this lawsuit to hold him accountable and stop him from violating that clause, can go forward. So here is a memo to the American people. The question we're asked most often is, can you stop him? You're in the minority. The answer is, Republicans control the Senate. The American people are on our side in their beliefs and views. Now is the time for Americans to rise up, those Parkland students, the survivors and victims of gun violence across the country, women who believe that the government has no place in their doctors' examining rooms or their bedrooms, people who believe that our air and water ought to be clean, that consumers should be protected. We all have a stake in this battle. And if America is heard, if those voices are real, we can win this battle. I'm very proud to turn now to Mazie Hirono, Senator Hirono from Hawaii.
Aloha, everybody.
Aloha. Aloha.
We know that the president has said that he wants his Supreme Court nominees to be someone who will overturn Roe v. Wade. So Judge Kavanaugh should not get the benefit of the doubt. He bears the burden of proof to convince all of us and the American people that he can indeed be a fair and objective justice, knowing full well that he has already been vetted by the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, whose goals are to overturn Roe v. Wade and repeal the Affordable Care Act. Not to mention, at a time when we have a president who pushes the limits of his executive powers, we want to know where Judge Kavanaugh is with regard to executive powers, because the indications are that he views executive powers as being vast. And as I said, at a time when this president pushes his executive powers to the limit, should we have somebody on the Supreme Court who believes that there should be an insulation of the president against either criminal or civil proceedings as long as he sits in office? So this is a very troubling nominee, but it's par for the course for this president. I certainly think that he nominated him because he is very concerned about the Mueller investigation and whether he can have a justice on the court who will sustain his what he thinks is his right to be free from prosecution. So on many counts, this is a very troubling nominee. And there are millions of people in our country who have pre-existing conditions. I am one of them. And we should be very concerned that this nominee has been vetted by the Heritage Foundation, whose goal is to repeal the Affordable Care Act and the protections that it provides for all of us, including the millions of us who have pre-existing conditions. Now we turn to Cory Booker, New Jersey.
I look forward to standing with my colleagues and all Americans in what will be the most important fight of our lifetimes. Will be no greater. And now, as an act of grace, I bring on my colleague, Senator Harris.
You're a cool cucumber, Cory. Cool when it's hot. Listen, if you are a young woman in America, or you care about a young woman in America, pay close attention to this nomination. Pay close attention. Because Kavanaugh has made his purpose clear. He told us that when he was on that list of 25. He has told us that in every decision that he has made on the issue of choice. And let's be clear about what this is about. It's about government taking on the decision about a woman and what she does with her body instead of giving that woman and her family and her God the power to make the decision for herself. This is about replacing the authority of government, putting the government's authority ahead of the authority of a woman to make a decision about her own body and her future. So if you are a young woman in America, or you care about a young woman in America, pay attention to this, because it will forever change your life. And the bottom line here is that one individual on this court makes a difference, who that individual may be. I know that based on personal experience, because had Earl Warren not been a member of this United States Supreme Court, that court will not have been and would not have been led unanimously to decide Brown v. Board of Education. Had that decision not come down the way it did, with the full force and authority of one individual who brought the entire court together, I would not be standing here as a United States Senator. Cory Booker would not be standing here as a United States Senator. The decisions that one person makes on that court can have ramifications for the future of our country. Pay attention to this, guys. Pay attention.
Well, let me thank all of my colleagues for their amazing statements that sum up the viewpoints. Questions for any of us? Okay, too late.
I think I know why.
Exactly.
Going twice.
Well, Mitch McConnell blocked judge after judge after judge on the courts. Then, so Leader Reid had no choice. But when we passed the law, we said Supreme Court should be different. Then Mitch McConnell changed that. And then to boot, he wouldn't let Merrick Garland have a hearing. Mitch McConnell has had as his goal to create a hard right Supreme Court, and nothing has stopped him. And if he weren't around, we would not be in this position.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Senator Schumer, you've talked a lot about Roe and health care, but how much of this debate will you focus on the nominee's executive powers?
A lot. That has become, we knew with any of the 25 nominees that health care and women's health, right to choose, would be important. But Kavanaugh brings a new prominence to the issue of executive power because he is almost certainly the most hard right of all of the 25. He is almost certainly the one who would most yield to presidential power. To say that if a president deems a law unconstitutional, he doesn't have to obey it, that's dangerous at any time, but it's particularly dangerous when Donald Trump is president, and we are going to make this a major and important issue.
Leader Schumer, some conservatives say that was also reporting by NBC News this morning that there was a negotiation between Kennedy and Trump that Kavanaugh would be a successor, that Kennedy felt secure with them. Is there a sense that maybe he would be a justice in the mold of
Anyone who gets the Good Housekeeping seal of approval from Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society and from the Heritage Foundation is not moderate, is not mainstream, is hard right, and wants to move America back decades. Thank you, everybody.